Okay, so it looks like we have most everybody who's going to be here. So for those who are here, we'll get started. Anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Audrey Albrecht. I am the Shorebird biologist here at SCCF, the Sanibel-captiva Conservation Foundation. We're a nonprofit dedicated to the conservation of our coastal ecosystems here in Southwest Florida. I have a couple of quick housekeeping items to go over as we're getting started here, and I can hopefully, excuse me. This presentation is being recorded because this is in a webinar format. We cannot see or hear you, participants, so we will take questions throughout. If you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A function down at the bottom, not the chat window, but the Q&A. You'll be able to type in questions. You can type them in when you have them, but we will get to the questions at the end of the presentation. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Ken Meyer. He's the co-founder, the research ecologist, and executive director of ARCI. That's the Avian Research and Conservation Institute out of Gainesville. He has a bachelor's in zoology from the University of Maine and his Ph.D. in zoology and behavioral ecology from UNC Chapel Hill. His postdoctoral research was on swallowtail kites at UF. Currently, he's an associate professor in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at the University of Florida. In the course of conducting 40 years of field research and producing management and conservation plans, Meyer and his team have captured, radiotagged, and studied the behavior and ecology of over 900 individuals of 20 different species in multiple countries and states in North and South America and Central America. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Meyer and his team over the last few years since I've been here with various projects with reddish egrets and with kites, and it's been a pleasure working with him, and I'm so pleased to be able to introduce him tonight, and I hope you all enjoy the presentation. So I'll turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, Audrey. Hi, everybody. Good to imagine you out there. And I'll be talking this evening about swallowtail kites. But before we do that, I'm going to summarize work that we've done on reddish egrets on Sanibel Island over the years, since 2015 or so. I'll start out with the reddish egrets, but first a word about ARCI. We are a nonprofit. We are dedicated to providing data, producing reliable data that supports wildlife management and conservation, particularly, especially, well, actually exclusively, birds that are at risk, imperiled for whatever reason, small populations, declining, unmanageable threats, loss of habitat, of course, all those things. So these may or may not be species that are listed as threatened or endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. For the most part, they are not. They are birds that we and many other people think are high priorities for conservation attention, but for which there are gaps in our knowledge that preclude developing management and conservation plans that are cost effective, that are effective, first of all, and affordable, feasible to implement. So, reddish egrets. If you're from Florida, especially if you're from a place like Sanibel Island, you've seen reddish egrets, I'm sure, in coastal places. Others of you may not. They are one of, in Florida, they're one of only 2 species of wading birds, along with great white herons, that live their lives basically on the coast. A mix of salt and brackish water, a little bit of fresh water, but mostly on the Gulf Coast of Florida, a little bit on the Atlantic side, but not in freshwater marshes to any great extent. They come in 2 colors, light and dark, or white and red. They're called morphs, color morphs or types, and that's the color of the bird for its entire life. People, biologists and birders used to refer to it as phases, but they're not color phases in the sense that they change. I would like to call attention first, go back here to my co-author, Gina Kent. We've worked together 20 years now, And ARCI started 23 years ago. And Gina's been involved in all the work that I'm going to tell you about tonight. And she's become competent and fluent and all that sort of thing. And she would normally, she might be giving this talk, or sometimes we do it jointly, but she's coming back for some field work down near Lake Okeechobee. We're going to be working on Sanibel tomorrow, along with a whole bunch of folks that are going to be looking for swallowtail kites. But Audrey's going to either tell you about that, or has told you about that, or will tell you about that in the near future, but it's an important mission. So at the bottom of this slide here, you'll see the funding support for our work on reddish egrets has come mainly from the sources listed there, especially the Ding Darling Wildlife Society, also known as the Friends Organization, the refuge itself, Sanibel-captiva Audubon Society, Sanibel-captiva Conservation Foundation, International Osprey Foundation, Judy Samuelson, Bill Schwabel, and the late Jim Griffith. So we thank all these generous organizations and individuals. The shades of purple there indicate the distribution of the reddish egret, and you can see it's all coastal. The largest U.S. population is over here on the Gulf Coast of Texas, a colony of 1,500 pairs in Laguna Madre, dredge spoils islands. Like a lot of wading birds, they will nest on these islands. Very unlike the foraging habitat and the nesting habitat of reddish egrets in Florida. It's interesting that that is the case. The population in Florida is much smaller, 350 to 400, maybe 450 pairs in the entire state of Florida. And they're down here also on the Yucatan Peninsula and other parts along the coast of Mexico, and out on Cuba also. That's important. In Florida, these yellow circles indicate the colonies, the nesting colonies that contain reddish egrets. They're usually mixed species in the case of wading birds. Most of the nest colonies are not exclusive to a particular species. Reddish egrets, though, they do not nest in large numbers anywhere. But that small number of pairs, around 400 or so, scattered around this map. You might see in places like the Keys and Tampa Bay and such, you might see 4 or 5 pairs in a particular nesting colony. On Sanibel, they're particularly easy and fun and wonderful to see and to watch from the Wildlife Drive. These are the reasons why conservationists, bird ecologists are concerned about reddish egrets. We don't know its status. We don't know its trend. Is it increasing, decreasing, or stable? They were much more numerous before the plume hunting trade in the Victorian era, when all the wading birds were shot in large numbers for their breeding plumage, which went into hats. Perfect reason to lose a species, of course. A lot of species came very, very close to extirpation. And reddish egrets were one of them. They recovered very slowly. They were thought to have been extirpated, that is, totally wiped out in Florida. But a few started to appear, and by the 1990s, there was an increase going on. However, that peaked pretty much by the early 90s and has stayed up around just 300 or 400, and it may be declining at this stage. Foraging habitat seems to be very distinctive and limited. They don't walk around like a lot of wading birds. They don't forage in soft, mucky bottoms of marshes. Instead, they feed on hard gravel or seashell, rubble, well-compacted sand with tidal waters moving back and forth with the tidal changes. And what they're hunting is the small fish that are very visible on those flats, not mud flats, but more harder stone and gravel and sand flats. And reddish egrets have a distinctive way of hunting. And that is probably why they have this particular habitat. If you watch them, they seem to be suffering from vertigo or inebriated or something. They put their wings out and they'll turn sideways, kind of, you can see my picture. It's a terrible imitation. If Gina was here, she does a great imitation of this. You'll have to ask her to do that when you see her sometime. But what they're doing is they're casting shadows. They're trying to get small schools of fish to move and then to come under the shadow of their wings, and then they strike at them. They eat very small fish, but they add up. We don't know if they move between the East and West Coast, but what we've seen so far in the two places where we've studied them, in the Florida Keys and on Sanibel, for the most part, they don't go far. They don't move seasonally in terms of migration, reliably north in the spring, south in the winter, that kind of thing. Fewer on the Atlantic coast and on the Gulf Coast for sure. And here are the people who have done most of this work I'll be talking about, Gina Kent and Amanda Powell. Amanda works part-time with us now, but she was full-time for about 6 or 7 years and still helps us out. The work started in the Florida Keys, the lower Florida Keys. So this is from Marathon westward, out past Key West. The colored dots you see in that map, each color is a different bird. This is another way of looking at the same data. They didn't make long movements at all. They would go from Summerlin Key, Big Pine, No Name Key, about midpoint in the lower Keys, and then they would go out to the small islands off of Key West between the breeding and the wintering season. But that was it. They didn't leave Florida. They didn't leave the lower Keys, actually. Now, on Sanibel, we wanted to focus on them here because they were prominent, but again, as they are everywhere, in very small numbers of all the nesting colonies in Florida. We put satellite tracking devices on 5 birds, each one a different color in this picture: blue, red, green, light purple, and white. 3 of the birds were tagged near Wildlife Drive, in the water right off of Wildlife Drive, and 2 over on Bunch Beach, where there was a very large flat, gravel flat, apparently the result of Phil trying to create a beach there years ago, and it provides good foraging habitat. So those are the 5 birds that we've learned so much from over the years. I think the longest we tracked any of them was into its 5th year. So this work started in 2014 or 2015. As you can see, this is their year-round distribution, except for one of the females, and I believe in this picture it was the red bird. Right after nesting was done, she would take a trip all the way up here to the Big Bend area, and she would just go for a few weeks in May and June, and then she would come back. That was her vacation. The other birds did not do that, and she did that for several years in a row, the whole time that we were tracking her. She might have been finding ways to avoid competition, because that's a major, very serious factor for reddish egrets. Serious in the sense that it's dangerous. Those bills are extremely sharp. They're very good at jabbing fish and catching them and moving very quickly, but they also compete over these foraging sites, which most biologists now think are a limiting factor for these birds. And they could explain why we have so few of them, and their population is always sort of precarious. That dead bird in the lower right, that was out on Boca Grande Key, about 8 miles west of Key West. Very popular place for reddish egrets down there. And that bird probably died as a result of aggression, of a brutal fight. It did not look like it had been attacked by a predator, and the predator, of course, would have taken it, or at least taken the head off and carried it, the rest of it somewhere. So, big factor: competition, food sites, feeding sites are limited, and it probably limits this population. Besides the movement studies and just learning that they don't go far away, and what threats they were subject to in the places they were moving, we also sampled fish prey, the prey of reddish egrets, to look at the distribution of species and also numbers per species. And we did this in two. I put this map back in here because we did it in 2 different places and then compared the results. Over here on Bunch Beach and over here on Sanibel. And what we found, surprisingly, just over this very short distance, The fish on Bunch Beach were larger in average size. There were some species not represented on Sanibel that were in the reddish egrets diet. We only had 2 birds tagged over there, a light morph and a dark morph. And so different species composition, different size, and fewer in number overall. And when you look at these ranges, you can see that the 3 birds over here overlapped quite a bit, whereas over here on Bunch Beach, they had pretty much dichotomous activity ranges, and the 2 birds here on Bunch Beach were quite aggressive toward each other. So even over this very short distance, we saw a difference in the food that they were eating, all fish, but different sizes and species, and they were much more competitive about their favorite sites over there on Bunch Beach. This is Ari Jimenez, who worked with us for several years. I'll show you his picture again in a minute with a bunch of his friends from Cuba. Yeah, this is Amanda holding a bird that was a panhandler. Audrey told us about this. They were able to pick the bird up. I think Audrey probably caught it herself, and then Amanda took a look at it. So here's a fishing lure doing a lot of painful damage to this bird. The folks at Crow did a great job of taking care of it, released it again, and it went right back to the same panhandling behavior in the same site. This is at Blind Pass, the pass between Sanibel and Captiva. Other reddish egrets were seen out there. Another bird actually did exactly the same thing. So obviously, if this was a bird in the wild and nobody had been able to pick it up, it probably would have died. This, the combination of fishing line and lures, trash out there in the environment, even though it might not look like much, it's so destructive to wildlife, and it's just pitiful. It's a disgrace that it takes such a toll on wildlife that is already having so much of a struggle just to maintain a sustainable population. And of course, sea level rise in response to climate change, probably the most serious factor affecting reddish egrets, because those foraging places are not going to be where they are now, probably within 10 years, certainly 12 or 15 years. And that's going to continue to change as sea levels rise. So are those foraging sites going to be recreated a little farther inland as sea level rises? Are the reddish egrets going to be able to, is that going to happen at a rate that will accommodate this current small population? Or is the small population going to take a further dip and get down to where even just a couple of hurricanes could destroy enough nesting habitat or kill some birds directly, which is probably less of a threat than a habitat destruction. Just an aside here, we looked at, we study a lot of species and several at the same time. And we looked at 9 species that we had tracking data for in response to the hurricanes that happened over the last 6 years or so. And it's remarkable that the storms did not, and some of these were very severe hurricanes, none of the individuals were killed, and none of them went very far away. They really, for the most part, they hunkered down on their existing home ranges, and they rode out the storms just fine. The only species out of the 9 that suffered a population level loss were the white-crowned pigeons that we were tracking from the Keys, and we tracked them out to their Caribbean winter ranges. We've done some tracking of them in the Caribbean as well. And what happened was they lost their foraging habitat, the hardwood hammocks on the mainline Keys where they forage, and their nesting habitat on the islands, and many white-crowned pigeons died. That was the exception to the fact that most of the birds did not die acutely from the hurricane, but they all suffered afterwards from the habitat destruction, lost nesting substrate or foraging habitat. So here it is. This is not a fabrication of anybody's imagination. This is a lot of very, very high-powered, accurate, reliable data from hundreds, if not thousands of different sources, all converging on these same predictions, and also stating with a great deal of clarity, most scientists would agree, that it is our fault and it was within our means to fix it, if it's not already too late. Not to be so pessimistic here, but we all need to be thinking about that every day and voting like it matters. Some hurricane tracks, what the Everglades look like after a big hurricane. some of the islands in the lower Keys. That landscape around that island, besides the dead trees on the island, that is not what it normally looks like. If it was, most people, tourists, would not come to the Keys to go snorkeling, etc. The bottom really gets torn up, the seagrass beds especially, very destructive. And there's just not enough of that habitat to support the species that are relying on it already. Another thing that's helped with reddish egrets, we've only done this in the Keys, we'd love to do it on Sanibel, is nest cameras to look at sources of nest failure. We've seen, well, siblicide, young attacking each other, but these are still frames, they're a little hard to decipher, but the one in the middle is an anhinga that displaced an adult, and it's rather large, almost ready to fledge young from a nest. And that anhinga then attracted a female, and they copulated on this reddish egret nest after displacing the egrets, and then they abandoned it. Such is life. Black rats are a problem. That's a manageable problem. That was almost good news. Oh, we have a nest predator that many people in the Department of Interior with refuges, et cetera, actually all over the world, rat management is possible on a scale where you actually can make a big difference in survival of bird nests. Raccoons also were a problem. We've been watching for iguanas, not seeing them yet. We see them on the islands. They cause a lot of problems. Nothing, if nothing else, just disturbance, because they're rather clumsy when they move around through the mangrove canopy. These are our Cuban colleagues. I mentioned Arian earlier. He's up here. But Aliene Gonzalez and Ianella Garcia. Ianella is right here. Ianella is studying Cuban martins. Aliene is studying reddish egrets. And we raised money here in the US to bring materials to them, nothing illegal, I swear, so that they could do these studies for their PhDs. They are the young students who are replacing Aaron, who emigrated here to Florida. Florida's the other major professor, Martina Costa. So these are the new faculty members at the University of Havana, and it was a pleasure to try to help them out, train them in the techniques we use to capture birds and fix transmitters and that sort of thing. Ianella discovered the winter destination of the endemic breeding population of Cuban martins. It's down on South America on the northeast coast. And Aliene is going to be redeploying some VHF transmitters soon, we hope, to get VHF tracking data, radio tracking data from reddish egrets. So keep an eye on reddish egrets. Listen for how they're doing, because, things slip between the cracks. This is a very, very precarious population, one of the most popular birds, enjoyable birds for birders and tourists in general to watch when they come to Florida and when they come to Sanibel. I should mention also that one of the things we did was with the fish prey, we separated out some samples, and with the very wonderful and knowledgeable help of the Sanibel-captiva Conservation Foundation and Audrey facilitated this with Kelly Sloan. They analyzed the fish for red tide. We lost 2 of the 5 reddish egrets to red tide. They died from it. Not the first year it was really bad. I guess that was 3 years ago, but the next year when it was even worse. And they did okay the first year, but the second year they became ill. Pro tried to take care of them. They did not survive. And there was a 3rd bird that may have been impaired. So just out of the birds that we tagged, the 4 that we were still tracking, 2 of the 4 succumbed to red tide. Lots of stories there within the stories, lots more we could say. Glad to tell you more individually if you have any questions or observations. Be happy to get in touch with us. I'm going to, from here on, I'll talk about swallowtail kites. This is a bird I started studying in 1988. I think that would be 33 years ago. Here in Florida, with support from the now extinct Non-Game Wildlife Grants Program in Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Initially, the commission started one of the first non-game wildlife programs in the country at a time when the federal government and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service were saying to states, you know, we really need your help out there, and we will help by providing money if you develop within your fish and game organizations, which were mainly dedicated to hunting and to huntable species. The federal government pushed all the states to develop non-game wildlife programs. Florida was one of the first and the best, an awesome program. The program still exists in some form. The grants program funded all kinds of work. We obtained funding to do the first work on swallowtail kites. We followed up on the wonderful work John Ogden did on short-tailed hawks. We had reddish egret support, white-crowned pigeon, magnificent frigate birds, great white heron funding, all from the non-game grants program, which disappeared under cover of darkness with no knowledge of the public. That was a decision made by the legislature and imposed apparently pretty easily on Florida Fish and Wildlife. And the only people you hear talk about it and reminisce in this regard are scientists who saw a lot of great work come of that money. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was the kind of money that would provide the seminal data for further work. And that's something that I should say about ARCI. Let's get another picture up here. We really focus on species that have problems, questions that if we could answer those questions, we might be able to facilitate management that would help stabilize declines or ensure them a brighter future. And then we move on. We try to be very, very strategic in the questions that we take on, and we study a wide range of species. So it is a lot of fun. It's very gratifying when we work directly with the managers, and I can give you a few examples of that in a few minutes, but working very directly with land managers, we like to think of them as very astute, practiced, and very wise farmers. And those managers who are passionate about managing the lands entrusted to them for critical species are really the people we like to hang out with professionally and tell them the management recommendations we've come up with for species like reddish egrets and swallowtail kites, etc. So that's what ARCI does. We're pretty lean and mean. Gene and I are the only two full-time employees right now, permanent employees. I would prefer otherwise, but at every level, state, federal, all the way down to county and local, money is drying up for this kind of research, and philanthropy cannot fill in the gaps. So here's a fact for you. You've probably heard this, especially if you're affiliated with a nonprofit or have any relatives or children who are trying to work for nonprofits. It's a huge workforce. It's a huge force in general, the nonprofit culture in this country. But just within the last, let's say since 2016 or so, the philanthropic landscape has changed dramatically. There's just not that much money being given away. A smaller number of people have a larger amount of the wealth, and it is not coming out and being donated to the places it normally would be. I hate to talk so much about money, but you know, it costs a lot to do this kind of work. We do it as cheaply as we can personally, but so everything has changed. And I'm telling you that because I'm sure there are nonprofits that are doing things that you consider very important in your life and for planet Earth. Not of them all, by no means all about biology. Think of the ones that you really admire and love and care about and help them out. And if one of them is us, we will do the best we possibly can with every dollar you provide. But I hope you'll give that some thought. Everybody, every nonprofit like us, there's a button on their website and it's prominent and it says DONATE. So that we try to make it as easy as possible. Thank you for indulging me there. So if you haven't already figured it out, one reason I started studying swallowtail kites is because they hadn't been studied. And Florida has most of the U.S. population, but the U.S. population used to look like that map on the upper left, all the way up the Mississippi drainage and the Ohio River drainage. And it doesn't look like that anymore. Between 1900 and 1940, that range contracted, and presumably the number of kites also went down dramatically, such that since 1940, 80 years over 80 years. This is what we have. The map on the lower right is the current distribution of swallowtail kites. And probably at least 2/3 of that population is here in Florida. So regarded it, many biologists thought, this is a kind of a sleeping problem. We think the population is small, 5,000 or so individuals, migratory, but nobody knew where they went for the winter. Imagine that. Well, they get here in February and March. They come up from the south, and I'll show you where they come from in a minute. But this is a copulation, a courtship offering that usually winds up ending in copulation. The male will bring in prey, he'll bring in nest material, and then every so many visits where he brings these things, the female will invite copulation right there on that dead stick. And the nest material she'll carry off and be working on building the nest. And in short order, they'll produce 2 eggs, usually near the top of one of the tallest trees emerging above the canopy. Usually it's a pine. In this case, it's a cypress. And moss and epiphytes of various species and genera and families even are really important to swallowtail kites because those epiphytes act as a matrix into which they weave the sticks, small sticks. So that reminds me to tell you that kites, not just swallowtails, but snail kites and Mississippi kites and white-tailed kites, black-shouldered kites, just here in the US alone. The kites are all lightly built. They have small bills and feet. They can't build massive, heavy nests with big sticks. They're highly social. Insects tend to be a large part of their diet. They are primitive raptors. They're a bridge between other species that are not so fierce and so fiercely built and not so powerful, not so strong. But the kites are called kites because they're very good at soaring, at gliding, at taking advantage of the least bit of warm rising air, thermals that are created as the sun warms the surface of the earth, taking advantage of that. So in the case of the swallowtail kite, they can go all day without flapping their wings once they get out of their night roost in the morning. So obviously very, very beautiful to watch. And they use that tail, as you can see in the picture in the upper left there, they use their tail to steer. It makes a great rudder. They have trouble landing and taking off, however, because they're built to be a glider, not a powerful aerial transport. They catch insects year round by catching them out of the air. Any insect that's flying is fair game for a swallowtail kite, all the way down to the dispersing flying stage of fire ants. Imagine that. People have found in kites that they have shot and looked at the stomach contents. That's the way people used to do natural history science decades and decades ago. Stomachs full of just one type of insect, even including ants. So they're up near the top of the tallest tree above the canopy where they can get in and out easily without getting blown around too much. This also puts them up above fire. As you know, pine landscapes in Florida are what it's called a fire-adapted landscape. Pine stands have to burn relatively frequently, 1, 2, 3, 4 years. Lightning strikes would be the major ignition source historically. If pine forests don't burn, hardwood species will take over. Simple as that. So here's an adult bringing some food in. Could be a male or a female. You can't tell the sexes apart. Here are a couple of young up there by themselves waiting. The nest usually has a bowl in it in the beginning where the eggs sit, but as you can see, it's kind of messy up there. So that bowl, that dip in the nest that held the eggs also would safely hold small nestlings. The problem is the kites, as I mentioned, being primitive raptors, they did not develop, it did not evolve in kites the behavior of shooting excrement over the edge of the nest by backing up over the edge of the nest, raising their tail, launching it out into space. In the kites, they just drop it in the nest. And the only hygienic means the adults have of managing that is to bring more moss and cover it up. Some of you might have roommates like that. I never thought about that before, but I'm not, just, dirty dishes and stuff. If we could just throw some Spanish moss over it, they would disappear. Well, in the case of the kites, yeah, it makes the nest a little bit cleaner, but it fills that bowl in and makes it much more precarious. Wind is one of the biggest sources of mortality for young kites this age. They can get blown right out of the tree, and in some cases, the entire nest gets blown out. And we will find the dead body of the youngster at the bottom of the tree. I want to acknowledge Max Stone, a great photographer, originally from Florida, who donates all kinds of beautiful pictures to us. We try to help him out getting into situations where he can safely do it, and he relies on our guidance so that he can do it without disturbing or jeopardizing the birds. So this is taken with a long lens from a camera that's out on the limb. That brown color will fade in the sunlight. It's a little bit of camouflage while the young are up there near the top of that tree, and they're vulnerable to avian predators like red-tailed hawks and great horned owls at night. In the moonlight, those whiteheads shine really well, but the brown takes some of the edge off that shine, but the feathers don't molt out and get replaced with white feathers. They simply fade in the sunlight. It's a very energy efficient little type of plumage replacement, in quotes, that is not costly at all. You can look at this as a sunset or a sunrise. I'd like to think of it as a sunrise. I'm going to tell you about what kites do, what swallowtails do at night. They gather in large roosts, and by using those roosts as a means to monitor the U.S. population, I'll show you how we do that. We've discovered in the last, I would say 6 years at least, probably a little before that, but we didn't know enough to trust it yet, a slow but steady increase in the swallowtail kite population. And we're all very, very glad to see that. We have a lot of management recommendations out there, a lot of relationships we developed with land managers, not only of national wildlife refuges and parks and national forests, but also commercial timber companies. Commercial timber stands, especially when they are sustainably managed. In other words, they grow as many trees as they harvest, and they have a steady state of production. Those sustainably managed forests make excellent nesting and foraging habitat for swallowtail kites. I'll show you a picture and illustrate that in a bit here. This is Gina going up to a swallowtail kite nest. I love this picture Mac took. He was up above in the tree, but particularly I want to point out a botanical point here. That's a nest tree, but look at the mid-story. There's pine, there's some cypress growing up there, there's all kinds of stuff. There's oak, cabbage palm coming up. That's perfect swallowtail kite nest habitat. They basically cannot see the ground. This is not a pine stand that has been burned frequently, and it usually is a wet site where even the best fire managers with the greatest number of drip torches and passion for doing prescribed fire might have trouble getting a stand like this to carry fire. Our recommendation is leave it alone, because what we've learned is great horned owls are the biggest predator of swallowtail kites. Great horned owls like to hunt rodents. If you think of a pine stand, that this is good nesting habitat here. But if you think of a pine stand that didn't have any of that mid-story, just those canopy trees, those pine trees up above, open underneath, a grassy layer, burn it every 1 or 2 years, stays grassy. You have quail, you have lots of things. You have great horned owls hunting from perches in the pines where they're listening for rodents on that open ground. Swallowtail kites don't want to nest where there are great horned owls. So they select nest stands that do not invite great horned owls. Pine stands that have not been burned frequently, that have this very busy, gnarly, hard to navigate mid-story and understory. So that was a big, I think one of our most important recommendations for land managers, especially in Florida, is burn in the growing season when it's starting to rain. That's great advice in general, instead of in the winter when you can burn lots of acres fast because it's dry and you can keep that big fire management budget, just keep that money coming in. So our recommendation is when you've got wet pine stands and you have trouble making it carry fire and it's expensive to burn, just leave it alone. And when I started to preach this, I did it, I think it might have been a Nature Conservancy meeting. Walt McGowan from Florida Fish and Wildlife, the late Dave Mayer, both of them have studied panthers. Walt McGowan studied black bears and deer. It turns out that these biologists and turkey biologists all say the same thing. And they say, we want people to get the same message. Don't force fire everywhere. Don't use aerial ignition in the dry season to burn every stick of everything in 1,000 acres at a time, because you're leaving no refugia for animals like swallowtail kites, turkeys, black bears, panthers, no place where they will want to raise young, pure and simple. And when we all figured that out, it was this one meeting, and we all just said, we're going to start spreading that gospel. And I think the word has gotten out there, and we're going counter to what most land managers are told about fire. But to change the subject, but that's good. You know, we're not saying don't burn anything. It's do it in moderation and do it in the natural season to the extent possible. You see some poles here. They're supporting a net that goes up 30 feet here and here. There's a mist net strung between. There's a live great horned owl. There's a kite nest back out of the picture. There's a blind right there. And when the swallowtail kite comes into its nest and it sees that predator there, it will circle and call. Other swallowtail kites will come, but the parents of that territory eventually may dive at that great horned owl, and one of them may get caught in the net. It's great sport. Sometimes you can spend weeks trying to catch a bird on a particular territory, and it never happens. But when it does, the data I'm going to show you next, we're going through the year of the kite. I'm going to show you the migration cycle, and then we'll finish up with when they come back to the nest locations. This upper right picture, there's a solar-powered satellite transmitter on the shoulders of that bird. We've never injured or killed any bird by catching it with these methods. We use variations on this with other species. This is Gina with it's a permanently crippled great horned owl. We had this particular bird. Her name was Dragon Lady. It was kind of her personality, but she loved being out there, and she told us, you know, she seemed to act that way, and she was very effective at catching kites. There is a mist net in this picture here, right? You can see, might be able to see the top line right there. The kite was seeing the net as well and staying above it as it dove. This is perfect natural swallowtail kite habitat, big cypress swamp. The pale green trees are cypress, but the dark green trees are pines. And this wet environment, again, those pine stands are loaded with mid-story and understory hammock, hardwood hammock vegetation. This is commercial timberland. In both cases, I would say sustainably managed timberland. And if you kind of squint and open your mind, close your eyes a little and open your mind, structurally, these are similar landscapes. And if that forest is sustainably managed so that any given time, you've got everything from a recent clear cut to an early stage of plantation pines, growing on up to mature stages. And in this floodplain that goes through here along this creek, this is Doctor's Creek in Georgia, you have these islands of pine, and we discovered by borrowing a helicopter and pilot from Georgia DNR that the kites really love to nest on the emergent pines in these pine islands in these hardwood floodplains. But the bigger point is this physical variation in these timber managed landscapes, and an ecologist would say, what you see in this picture represents several serial stages of ecological growth on this landscape. Everything from the basic early successional stages succeeding through to mature forest, bare ground to mature forest. And that mimics this. In this case, the forest gets opened up by hurricanes and fire, keeping it this mosaic of open and forested landscape. In this case, the disturbance factor is different, but it has the same effect. So this was good news because the Southeast is one of the most productive places in the world for making timber. Marketable, it's a good way to make a living. And what you see is on the floodplains of the Atlantic and the Gulf and Peninsula Florida, about down to Central Florida. The dark green here, these are places where we had over 1,000 nests, relatively early. We continue to find nests, but a land manager can zoom into this map and find their ownership, their parcel of land, and they can see whether or not they have kite habitat on their land. And then we are happy to talk to them and tell them the kinds of things they can do to make it better. We're in the 5th year of a great collaboration with American Bird Conservancy, who has been supporting us financially to engage with them on 11 species of disappearing birds or imperiled birds, conservation interests, including swallowtail kites. And looking at the numbers and the distribution and the status of these birds on commercial timberlands. Sustainable Forestry Initiative funded this to the American Bird Conservancy. Some of that passed on to us. And the short of it is, we've learned even more about what to recommend to timber managers. And we have developed this incredibly large and enthusiastic audience. And this is really a win-win. One of the best things they can do for swallowtail kites is to thin plantations. You take out every 4th or 5th row and the adjacent trees grow up above the canopy. Bingo, you have attractive nest trees for swallowtail kites. They don't burn, but on short rotation timber, they have a lot of quick growth up under these stands. That excludes great horned owls, and the kites like it. Very rare to see prescribed fire on commercially managed timberlands. It's expensive to do, and there's a lot of liability for smoke, car accidents, et cetera, that are caused by smoke. So the timber companies don't do it. Again, making it even more attractive to swallowtail kites. They're done nesting. They start leaving the nest. The young become capable of flying and catching food on their own. This is an adult. These gatherings happen in June in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, out in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. And the birds gather during the night, or during the day rather, on areas where they can hunt insects over recently mowed hay fields or various other things, but open areas. And then come late June and early July, they start gathering in large night roosts, shown here in this picture by Mac. Pre-migration communal roosts, that sums it up. That's what they are. We have found over the years probably at least 15 roosts that contain 200 to 4,000 individual swallowtail kites at their peak in late July. This is the kites when they're rising up out of the roost in the morning. They split up into smaller groups. They go out over the landscape and they start hunting insects. They're not catching baby birds and tree snakes and tree frogs. Day roosting bats, that's what they bring to their young. That's what's efficient to carry back to a nest, a big package. No, they're putting on fat themselves by catching and eating insects, and they're very, very good at it. This is a section of a big roost. The biggest roost in Florida has over 4,000 down on the western side of Lake Okeechobee, and freshwater marsh interspersed with mature cypress and pine forest. The roosts are very quiet in the morning, but as soon as the air starts to rise from the warmed ground, they'll start rising up. What we've done, we've learned to do since 1989, and especially since 2006. Since 2006, we've been focusing every year in late July. We do a series of flights that embrace the peak, which is the 3rd week of July, that bracket that peak. And we take pictures like this from the air, and Gina counts all those white heads. We get highly accurate numbers of kites in the roosts, and we look at changes over time, and it is that information. Remember, 70% of the kites are nesting in Florida, and kites from Georgia and South Carolina come through Peninsula Florida when they're migrating. So we are counting a very large portion of the U.S. population very accurately, and it is this information that is demonstrated that the population is slowly increasing. That's how we do it. That's a stand of cypress that were killed by toxins coming out of a sand mine that is just to the left out of the picture. So that's what happens to some of these, I want to call them sacred sites. These sites that are so important because birds in that picture, those white heads there, some of those individuals are going to be launching out over the Gulf of Mexico that night, that very night. And they need to be well rested and well fed because they've got 450 to 600 miles of open ocean to cross. Raptors do not usually do that. Very rare. Peregrine falcons, swallowtail kites are two of the only species that do. So they need to rest, they need to be quiet. And this is one set of important management recommendations for managers, private landowners, everything. Amateur photographers, leave them alone, stay back. You can have beautiful views, get beautiful pictures, but don't ever, ever disturb them enough to make them flush. Unfortunately, a lot of that has happened, including people taking pictures from helicopters. This is what satellite data look like going south. This is southern Florida. Each one of those colored tracks is a different bird. The squares are individual GPS fixes. So remember, these are GPS scale data, 10 to 15 meters of accuracy, coming in every 2 hours, every day, stored overnight or for a couple of days at the most, then transmitted up to either to satellites or to cell phone towers, where companies then retrieve the data and sell it to folks like us. This is a bunch of birds, all the same color, going to the Yucatan Peninsula. This is the only place where they slow down and stage in really large numbers. Gina did part of her master's research on this phenomenon over here on the Yucatan Peninsula. That's a lot of water to cross. They might go over Cuba, but they don't necessarily land there. They're usually fat enough, charged up, and ready to go. They try to migrate on tailwinds and make it all the way to the Yucatan. This map shows this bird riding these winds toward the Yucatan, but the problem is it's not always that good. It's a 5,000-mile journey. Once they get across the water, they're over land all the way down to their winter destinations, which are concentrated here in Brazil and also down here, two different concentrations. Usually when they leave Florida to go south, they get right over to the Yucatan and then they're safe over land. This is we've done this since 1996. Last year, 2020, this is what we saw of 11 birds. We have a great colleague, by the way, in Louisiana, Dr. Jennifer Colson, and she's tagging some kites also and includes them in our samples. So we've worked with her and been friends with her for a really long time. 3 birds last summer, when they left the large roosts in late July and early August, they got almost to the Yucatan. They were headed toward the Yucatan Peninsula. We had strong easterly winds carried them all the way across the Gulf. You would think they would make landfall. Only one of them survived. This red bird here did this little curlicule. It actually turned out this way, counterclockwise in a low pressure system. Didn't go into Mexico here. It went all the way up into Houston, spent about 2 weeks in this area resting. We have determined that a kite can survive over the water for 4 days and nights. That's it. They can't support flight any longer than that, probably because they run out of water. But the other 2 birds here, the blue one and the purple one, they made it almost to the Mexican coast, 15 to 20 miles. Both of them died before they could make landfall. We've never seen this happen before. Usually, it's very rare that a kite dies going south. Most of the mortality over the Gulf happens going north in the springtime. But first, I'll show you where they winter. We're wrapping this up soon. So we're going through the whole year. These are privately owned ranch lands, old family, multi-generational ranch lands in Brazil. Great habitat for swallowtail kites. Wetland forests, floodplains, they can hunt over, forests, pastures. These pastures are loaded not only with cattle, but termite mounds as tall as your car in some places. And when those termites emerge, it's a huge, huge source of food for the swallowtail kites. We learned this by tracking birds and employees of ARCI, including Gina and I in more recent years, went down there and studied kites on their winter range and had lots of support from these ranchers. The unfortunate thing is cattle ranching doesn't make a lot of money. It's a great tradition. People love it and supports a lot of wildlife, but it's being converted, has been, continues to be, to soybeans and sugarcane on a massive international industrial agricultural scale. We're losing that wintering habitat. And some of it is being sprayed heavily as in the soybean field, right where there's a cup right here. This was the last GPS fix of a female we had tracked for several years. She died in this field. Some good friends of ours looked for her and could not find her, but they were told they had to wear hazmat suits because the field had recently been sprayed. And that crew of wonderful folks went out and found all the discarded pesticide containers that they could, took pictures of the labels. Half of these compounds are illegal in Europe and North America. So kites are dying down there for this reason, unfortunately. Northbound, they follow the same track northward. We're almost done with the year, and I'm almost done with this long talk. But when they get to the Yucatan Peninsula, they don't go to the tip of Cuba and back to the Florida Keys. Those are tiny targets, easy to miss. Instead, orange is northbound, green is southbound. When they're coming north, this is where their patterns diverge from how they got south. They sit here on the Yucatan until they have a tailwind. They feel a tailwind, they jump off. Any southerly component, it could be southeast, it could be southwest, or from the dead south, will carry them up into the sort of this terrestrial safety net. If they can stay aloft for 4 days and nights, they'll make landfall. Not all of them do. Here's a bird a couple of years ago that left the Yucatan right here, started north, everything is looking good. It's going to wind up somewhere maybe in the Big Bend of Florida or the Panhandle. But here it gets out of southerly winds and into easterly winds. One high pressure system replaced another, and the bird got, westerly winds. The bird got blown to the east. We thought it was going to head into Florida, but then it hit northerly winds. And you can see all this happening on a weather map. We can superimpose a prognostic chart on here, and you can see exactly what happens. Went all the way down. We thought it was going to make it back to Cuba. So we're seeing this, not quite in real time, but almost. We thought it would get back onto Cuba, but no, it caught a northeasterly wind and headed toward the Yucatan, where it had begun. And we thought, okay, finally, it's running out of time. It was almost up to 4 days. We thought it was just going to go right back into the Yucatan and wait for another tailwind. But no, it continued out into the Gulf. And sorry, I thought I had oh, here's the thumbnail. This is this box right here. It just turned in place, started back, and died right there. Fell into the drink, no doubt. So it's not safe. They want to get back. They want to get back to the territories they nested on the previous year because that is where they're going to find their mates. They don't migrate together, the pairs. They don't winter together, but they will nest together for as many years as they can both make it back to that territory that they used previously. Here's a good news story that looked like it was going to turn out really bad. Another bird going north, thought it was doing fine, headed toward Florida. That wind changed, went down to Cuba. We thought, okay, this bird only needs to get to Miami. That's where it nested the previous year. Well, it didn't go to Miami. It had a southeast wind, so it just went right across the Gulf, right into the Mississippi River Delta, right before it ran out of time. And then it went overland, and when it got over here near Apalachicola, it was feeling so good apparently that it just took a shortcut over the water and eventually got back to its nest in Miami. I'm going to finish this story and wrap up with acknowledgments. But this is one of my favorite slides. This is 5 different birds coming north, 5 different swallowtails, each a different color. And what you see is there were some variations on the northbound route. Some of them they'll leave Venezuela and they may go over to Honduras, Nicaragua, and rest, and then go up into the Yucatan again and jump off. That's what most of them do. But sometimes they just cut across the Caribbean. And this bird went across Cuba, did not stay long, went all the way up here, made landfall. Like every other one of these birds, when it made landfall, they waste no time. They turn in the direction of their previous year's nest, and they head straight for it. The terminus of every one of these 5 lines is where that bird nested the year before. These are the ones that make it. People often ask, one of the most frequent questions is, do they mate for life? And they would, I think, if they both survived and both got back to the nest in time. Some of them get delayed and their mate may repair, with another bird. But so that's the year of the swallowtail kite. And I wish everybody could know that. think about what goes into that. Think of what this bird sees. You know, how many of us have been to all of the countries that fall under the shadows of the swallowtail's wings in the course of just 1 year, 10,000-mile round trip in straight line distances, not including all the diversions. All the countries they see, and they do that trip year after year after year. We've tracked satellite tracked birds for 5 to over 7 years, individuals, and they just keep doing it if they don't die. So something I want to remind you of, if you're citing any of the birds we're studying and want to share that information or any interesting sightings, you can go to our website. That's the address, the one and only. Any species that we're working on, and you'll find that there. Also, you can look at a recording of this talk. The opening slide has most of our study species on it right now. But another thing you can do if you have this interest in contributing data as a citizen scientist, we have a particular specific swallowtail kite sighting report program on our website. Here are the things you can do for swallowtails or any of these species. Just support our mission, our morale, our finances, any way you choose to help. Follow our website and Facebook page. Tell us what you're seeing. You can go to the website and make these reports, and we get a lot of really interesting information that way. And on our website, you'll also find how to find and monitor swallowtail kite nests. These are the instructions, and they work. Believe me, we've done this over the years, and you can do it too. And what you'll learn from this is how to do it in ways that will not disturb the birds or cause them to flush, or certainly not abandon their nests. So you'll find that sort of stuff on our website. Down the left here are some of the people, just some of the field technicians. And I put Audrey on here, just the help that she's given us on Sanibel over the years. Some of these people go back to 1988, like Steve, Audrey and John. But Audrey's been a real champion of swallowtail kites on Sanibel. And that's why we're headed there tomorrow to help her and friends from SCCF organize some nest searching there. These are all the organizations, not even all of them, over the years. Thank them so much for their support. This is what keeps us going. And the boost in morale, knowing that people care and trust what we do, is worth way more than even all the money that we need to do this. So thanks to all of them, and thank you for your patience and your interest. I'd be glad to try to answer any questions or listen to your comments. Audrey's going to manage those.
Okay. Well, the first question we have from Mike is actually a perfect segue into a question I wanted to ask. So Mike's asking if any of the reddish egrets or kites nest on Sanibel, which after we answer that, I guess you could elaborate a little bit about how the kites are nesting on Sanibel, but using Australian pines, which aren't a species you mentioned as a nesting tree earlier. So what is it about these Australian pines that they're wanting to nest in, and why are they coming to Sanibel to do it?
Yeah, great question. First of all, the reddish egrets nest, the ones that we tracked, the ones that actually nested, and they don't all nest in all years. We're on an island in Tarpon Bay that is the major wading bird colony in the National Wildlife Refuge. Swallowtail kites were not there until, Audrey, when did they start nesting on the island?
I'm not sure. I know that when I started in 2016, I had heard whisperings of a few nests around the island, and it seemed to be, from what I was gathering from folks who've been here a lot longer than me, that was a pretty big deal, that they weren't aware of them nesting here in the past. So over the last few years, we're seeing quite a few more nests. So we're really interested to figure out what's going on with that.
It's really, more and more people have been seeing them. It's just, it really does seem to be in the last 5 or 6 years. Maybe they were doing it longer, but you know, this is such a distinctive bird. You know, when I studied swallowtail kites in southern Florida, as I said earlier, they prefer native pine, slash pine, longleaf pine, loblolly pine, but they also nest in Australian pines. Casuarina is the genus name. They're often called that. In southern Florida, you know, down in Everglades City, you know, developed areas in the Keys, the kites were nesting in those trees, but statistically, they were more likely to fail. Their nests were more likely to fail in Australian pines than in native trees. So We are here on Sanibel working on reddish egrets, and we start hearing about Jim Griffith, the late Jim Griffith, president of Sandcap Audubon and excellent conservationist. He was one of the first to tell us about people seeing them in Australian pines, and he really tried to spread the word about what a special thing this was. So the problem is Australian pines are an exotic, they're an invasive exotic, and good land managers remove them. Naively, we knew this was coming, and the city wants to start doing this, and no one wants to stop them. But in the last few years, the number of swallowtail kite nests, which made up to at least 5 territories, Audrey, perhaps 5 more that people just haven't seen, maybe. So, we're going to try to find out. A big community effort here, but. I thought, well, okay, if the Australian pines are removed, there's slash pines. There's a few small scattered slash pines on Sanibel. Well, there really are not. So this is one of those conservation conundrums where we're going to manage and eliminate an exotic species that needs to be eliminated, but a species that could use our help in the meantime has adapted to using them. This is just what little we hear. This is not a large enough sample to be meaningful, but Australian pine nests on Sanibel seem to succeed fairly well. Average nest success in the wild for swallowtails is about 50%. So maybe they've been doing a little bit better. I don't know. But right now, I think the mission is just to make sure that none of the Australian pines that the kites are trying to nest in this year are going to be removed right away. Audrey.
Yeah. I'm hoping we get a few more questions, but I guess we can talk a little bit about our plans. Basically are to assess all the suitable habitat for swallow-tailed kites on the island over the next couple days, and hopefully be able to pull in some volunteers to help, something similar to what we have going on with Audubon's Eagle Watch, a citizen science program where folks can monitor nests and report to ARCI, and we can really get a better understanding of how the kites are using our islands and how we can manage properly for them. I guess stay tuned for more once we figure out what we have going on here.
Yeah, and what we have to think, you wonder, well, why did they come to Sanibel? If there aren't their favorite species of nest tree, they're not into beaches. So maybe good feeding opportunities, good foraging. And once they build a nest, they can take particularly good care of their young. I'm thinking that if they're displaced from Sanibel, the nearest place where they'll find good native pine nest habitat will be Pine Island, aptly named. So they're going to be okay. But we don't want to interrupt their nesting efforts this year with chainsaws and harvesting devices.
I think another question someone asked me recently was, how big of a stand of pines do you think that the kites need, and do they need fresh water right nearby?
Their favorite nesting habitat is hydric pine forest or cypress, which is hydric, meaning sort of swampy. It doesn't mean it has to have deep water or to have water year round, but in the summer, they like to nest, and they also like to roost in trees that are in standing water. They can nest in a single pine, but they're more likely to nest in a small island of pines, at least 3 or 4 or 5 trees. The trees buffer some of the wind from each other. A little stand of even 4 or 5 pines is more likely to stay standing in the face of strong winds than just a single tree. The pine islands, with hammock vegetation underneath, and then expansive wet prairie and a cypress dome here and a hardwood hammock there and some dwarf cypress over there. That's classic natural swallowtail kite habitat.
Awesome. Looks like we got another question in regards to the reddish egrets. She says, I understand we lost a couple of the ding reddish egrets to red tide this winter. Do we know how many are in ding this year? So I actually haven't been on the wildlife drive myself in a few months, I'm ashamed to say. So Have you heard about many more egrets moving into that territory?
I think there's probably half the people in the audience would probably have a better estimate than I. I haven't been there often enough.
Okay.
Yeah, does anybody like to say how many have been seen at once, or how many different individuals you think are around there right now?
Okay. While we wait to hear that, next question is, do the young return to the area they hatched? I am not sure if they're referring to the egrets or the kites, but I guess maybe you could answer to both.
Yeah, swallowtail kites. Here's the catch. In any bird, the highest mortality of their whole lifetime, the highest risk of mortality is in their first year. And of that time, most of it's going to happen probably in the first 30 to 60 days after they fledge from the nest. The tracking devices we use, they cost anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 each. So for financial reasons, but even more importantly, putting a tracking device, I should say, these devices are limited to 3% of body weight. That's a statute, an established regulation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Geological Survey. We don't exceed that. We're very gentle, very careful in attaching them. We use methods that have been proven over many years. And Gene and I do all the tagging. It's not something we leave to anybody else. And we don't have injuries or mortality from it. But a young bird that leaves its nest and within a few weeks is going to be flying out across the Gulf of Mexico or part of the Caribbean, we prefer not to put tracking devices on them. So we could put a small VHF radio transmitter on, but they don't have batteries big enough to still be transmitting in the spring when the birds come back. So, that's a real interesting question. You think after all these years we could have answered, but no, we don't know. We do see the typical number of swallowtail kites you'll see at an active nest. So here's a clue for nest searching, those of you who aspire to this grand, noble effort. The average number is 3 birds. The mature male, mature female pair, and then a bird that behaviorally seems to be a subadult, non-breeding male looking for opportunities to mate and to pick up a female. But on average, they don't breed until they're 3 or 4 years old. We do know that from some banding information. So there is a young bird hanging around the nest. They don't help. Mostly it's self-interest. And only one time have we seen them copulate with a paired female, but it was after her young had fledged. Her male was still around, but this third bird that had been there, presumably, and it was indeed a him, did manage to copulate with the resident female. That's what I know.
And I did get a response that they have seen as many as 6 reddish egrets on a good day on the wildlife drive. So it sounds like maybe some have moved into that territory.
Yeah. So that suggests that the number is staying pretty steady, a small number. But, these birds, as you see, are site faithful. And, you always wonder, you go to a place like Sanibel, Ding Darling, Merritt Island, around Cedar Key. And, you see all these birds, and you go back the next year at the same time of year, and you see all these birds. A lot of those individuals are exactly the same ones. So many species are strongly site faithful to their breeding sites or roosting sites or stopover sites, often to the same tree. It's just one of those beautiful phenomena about wildlife biology, bird biology. The more you learn, the more you're amazed, and the more you think this can't all possibly be true. It's just too amazing, and it's too beautiful, and just gets better all the time when you study it.
I got one last question sent in via text. Do they nest in any broadleaf trees?
Swallowtails, I assume?
Yeah.
Yes. That's a really good question. As I say, pine and cypress. However, on some timberland here up in near Cedar Key, large tracts, the Gulf Hammock area, we did have one area that was being managed for hardwoods. And of course, commercial timber companies could sell everything. Everything out there can be turned into something you can sell. And so there was this interesting area. We didn't see it before it was cut, but it was a live oak hammock. And they thinned it. They left a large number of those really ancient spreading oak trees. And we're going to just let it grow back in naturally, not plant it as oak, and harvest it again probably in 25 to 40 years. We had a kite nest colony. Oh, this is a good point to say something I missed. Swallowtails are social in everything they do all year. They even nest in small colonies of 2 to 5 nests, not right on top of each other, but easily within sight and earshot of each other. And of course, they sleep together, forage together, migrate together, roost together, etc., die together over the Gulf of Mexico, we're sure, when they hit headwinds. They're not migrating alone. So when we see something happen to one of those birds that we've tagged, we know that there are more that are in trouble. And I forget what year this was. It's only been about 5 or 6 years. But as when we were first starting to see weather effects of climate change, changes in patterns of high pressure systems, we had 11 swallowtail kites tracked, and we lost 3 of them coming north over the Gulf of Mexico because of prolonged northerly winds. And there was actually a picture in the paper during that time, the largest high pressure system meteorologists had ever documented in the Western Hemisphere. It extended from Canada down to the Caribbean, one single high pressure system, and it created northerly winds. There's a circular clockwise circulation. And with that high sitting to the west of the migration route, the winds were from the north. But on the Yucatan Peninsula, local winds were sometimes from the south. The birds got suckered into it. We lost 3 of 11 because of that aberrant weather condition that was attributed to climate change and changes in the position of the polar vortex. That was really frightening to think of what that might portend.
So I think we're getting close to out of time. I think there's a couple questions here we can probably answer pretty quick. And so one of them is the life expectancy. Do you know the average life expectancy for the kites?
No, the radios usually quit before the birds do, but as I mentioned, 5 to 7.5, almost 8 years. And those few birds that went up to 7 years plus, their radios quit and they were still alive. And when we caught them, they were at least 4 years old. That's all we can tell you. I would guess that there are mature, overly mature individuals in the breeding population that are over 20, perhaps 25 years old. I just saw that the albatross, Laysan albatross wisdom, is nesting, producing young. She's at least 70. She was banded as an adult by Chandler Robbins, who was the author of the Golden Guide, the first field guide series. He's a federal bird biologist. Yeah, Ken Robbins banded that bird. I think there was another female also. That was that old. Okay, I'll answer the next one even shorter. Sorry.
I think I can combine these two. One is asking if they'll nest in a man-made platform, and one is asking if they'll nest in a Norfolk Island pine. So would either of those serve as a good nesting substrate?
I don't think we've seen any in Norfolk Island pines, but somebody may have. They're denser than casuarinas. And the cause of failure, when I said they had low nest success in Australian pines in South Florida, they were getting blown out by the wind even more frequently than in native pine or cypress. So no, not Norfolk Island pine in any great number. And what was the first part?
The man-made platform.
Oh, platforms. We did try that. Gina got great at not only climbing trees, but putting up artificial nests that look just like real kite nests from the year before. Because the kites will come back. They'll actually see an old nest, we think, and key in on that as, oh, that must be good habitat. There's a kite nest, because they're very distinctive. So we put up some platforms, Gina would do this, and then put a few decoys, swallowtail kite decoys around it in the same tree or adjacent trees. And we did that quite a bit without success until we finally got a few cases where kites moved in. And we thought this could be a good management technique if we're trying to lure them off of threatened land onto a protected area nearby. We might be able to use that technique. We would be happy to try that on Sanibel. The problem is we don't have any native pines to put the platforms in. And on the one hand, I'm eager to try it, just a platform on a pole, like osprey nests. On the other hand, that might sucker them into doing that when they would have a very low probability or high probability of mortality or depredation. So I just not sure what to do there.
Okay, well, I think that's about all the time we have, but I can't thank you enough for coming and sharing all your knowledge with us, and I'm really excited to see what that you're going to share your expertise with us as we figure out our kite situation on Sanibel. And thanks to everybody for coming. I do have one quick announcement that this is the last evening of the Homestead for this season. Hopefully next season we can start doing these in person again at our Homestead outdoors. And the next event that SCCF is co-hosting with Sanibel Community House is going to be Tuesday, March 23rd from 6:30 to 8. And that's going to be solutions for a renewable energy future for Sanibel and the region, talking about renewable energy options for the island here. I think that's all I have. I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Meyer for coming and for all of you for coming and watching.
Thank you again, Audrey, and thanks to SCCF for all the great work you've been doing. And we'll continue, I'm sure.